women supporting women in the sport of diving is a very important part. And so if anybody's listening, I'm sure I speak for Hannah, Kate, and Jami, that email us, send us a message on our Instagram or on our YouTube channels or whatever social media is right for you. We want to bring and encourage and inspire you to share your voice.
Off Gassing, a scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. Today on the roundtable, I sit down with this accomplished group of underwater photographers and hear their thoughts about capturing images within the underwater world. Join me along with Hannah Tilley, Kate Jonker, Annie Crawley, and Jami Leslie Feldman. I hope you enjoy. If you are enjoying the show, please leave a review on your podcast listening platform. If you are really enjoying the show, share your favorite episode with family and friends. So I would like to welcome everybody to this edition of the Roundtable. Today we are getting a group together to speak about photography. I am quite excited about this because I actually do not do any underwater photography. It's something that I've thought about for quite a long time, but I'm sure that I will learn some things, and I would have to think it's probably not as easy as I would. Well, photography in general, I don't think is easy. I just do dry stuff, but yeah. Either way, enough about me. Let's go around the room. We'll start with Annie, and then Jami, Hannah, and then Kate. So if you want to just tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are, and we'll get this roundtable started.
Sure. I'm Annie Crawley. I'm also known as Ocean Annie. I'm an underwater photographer, filmmaker. I've been a scuba instructor for 30 years and a writer, author, filmmaker. I don't know. I do everything ocean. When I slipped below the surface, I found home and I never came out. So anything that I can do to connect people to the ocean is what I'm all about. And water. I've definitely a blue mind.
I'm Jami Feldman. I'm known as Underwater Paparazzi. That handle kind of came up as a joke when I first started scuba diving. We were all heading out for a dive, and I'm obsessed with my camera and was like, don't worry, the Underwater Paparazzi will be there. And I'll be like, I wonder if that's available. I started scuba diving in 2008. I got introduced to it at a Discover Scuba when I was in Hawaii for a wedding. I had a friend who wanted to do it, and I was like, okay, I'll try. It was a big hole from there and just went spiraling downward. Got under the water and was like, this is really cool. Photography I've actually been doing since I was 11. My mom created the monster. She threw me in a black and white darkroom class when I was in middle school. It was an elective class, and I just have loved it ever since. I primarily like to, well, I've lately been doing dumb reels and stuff because I find it funny, but I loved to show what's available, especially stuff locally in San Diego because it's so cold here. I know a lot of people do warm water, and just kind of showing people what is out there to see and inspiring people to want to help protect oceans, possibly even use my content to do that. And that's what brings me joy.
Awesome. All right, my turn. I'm Hannah. I am the owner of I Love Nudies. I'm an underwater photographer here in Edmonds, Washington. So also, I think we're all cold water because Kate's even South Africa. So, and as soon as I started diving, I had that same urge to just show everyone what we could see, especially here in Washington. I felt like so many people had no idea how beautiful it was under the dark water. You know, it looks so murky, and so I just wanted to show everything. And I had a small photography background through high school, taking lots of photography and design classes. And so I was super excited to get, you know, my first GoPro and then move from there. And so I'm hooked. One of the things that I think is really cool about diving and photography is that you can do it forever, and I want to do it for my whole life. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Kate Jonker. I'm from Cape Town in South Africa. And yes, it's not just warm water diving in South Africa. We wear dry suits. It's pretty cold here. It's summer here right now and the water is 11 degrees. But yep, we're in dry suits mainly the whole year. And I got into underwater photography quite late in my scuba diving career. I started diving 23 years ago. It was something I always wanted to do. I'd always snorkeled as a child, growing up on the beach here in South Africa. And it's something I always wanted to do, but life got in the way and I had children. So when they were old enough to kind of be left with other people, I jumped into the water and learned to scuba dive, and I've never looked back. As far as underwater photography goes, I actually only really started taking it seriously in about 2015. I had tried to take photos before. We went on a holiday to Mozambique and we used a camera with film. And you go on holiday and you come back hoping to have amazing pictures from those 11 reels of photos that you took pictures of. And I think there were about 10 pictures that actually came out. So yeah, then my husband and I started a scuba diving business here in Gordons Bay, and I got a little bit bored swimming around with him and his students. So I thought, what am I going to do? So I got a camera and I started documenting their scuba diving journeys, and the photos were so bad. They were green and they were blurry, and I just didn't know what to do. So I just took videos. And I made videos for probably about 2 years until I thought, no, this is ridiculous. I've got a camera. I've got to learn how to use and to take good pictures. And that was in 2011. And then in about 2015, I got a proper camera and I haven't looked back. And yeah, apart from my photos, I write. I'm an underwater photo coach. I have 2 Instagram accounts, one Kate Jonker Photography, and the other one is Kate_underwater photo coach. And that's me in a nutshell. Hi, everybody.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. And so I guess I kind of, my first question I wanted to ask, and I think some of you had answered that, is if you were a photographer before you got into scuba diving. But I guess I'll kind of pivot that question a little bit, is if somebody was going to get into underwater photography, what is some pieces of advice that you could give? Because I'm sure there's so somebody like me, for example, I call it dry photography because I just do land and it's just a strictly hobby. But what are some pieces of advice that you could probably give to somebody that wants to get into underwater photography?
So, Nick, I've got this saying that I think would be appropriate for you, and it's you don't have to be great to get started, but you have to get started to be great. And when I got started, it was back in film days. So we had 36 pictures and we went with a 10% rule. But the average camera costs the price of a car. So I literally sold my car to buy my first underwater camera system. Oh, wow. When I knew that I was going to pursue underwater photography and filmmaking. And now we hold a movie studio in the palm of our hands. And so if you want to get started, you could get started with a GoPro, a mobile, any kind of camera for less than $500, and sometimes even less than that. And so my advice is always think about neutral buoyancy first, camera second, but everybody is a photographer in today's world.
In addition to that, I think it's also important for when you are starting with either a GoPro or any other camera system is to not jump into the huge DSLR systems right off the bat, because some people end up not liking the weight of it. Some people decide they only like doing macros. Some people decide they hate video or they love video. And I think that can really influence your choice of camera with how expensive these are. It's better to kind of figure that out in the beginning with something a little bit more affordable, like a GoPro, and move from there. You can still do some macro stuff on GoPro, definitely wide video stills. It kind of gives you a good idea before you spend a lot of money.
Photography is definitely, I swear I picked the 2 expensive hobbies, photography and scuba diving. Well, they can be, but like, I guess you're right with the, everybody has a camera movie maker in the palm of their hand these days. So that is very true. Has anybody tried, any of the underwater or the, phone cases for underwater, like photography or video? I know those are becoming quite popular.
I think they're great if you're starting out. I get mad because I don't have enough control over settings.
Oh, okay.
So I think they're cool.
Yeah, I think there's a lot on the market. Everybody from Sea Life to there's a one that I just got in a box right here. It's called Vogue. And so there's quite a few now out that are really, really great. I think that there's a certain level of trust for a lot of people to put their $1,000 mobile into a housing. But, this goes back to almost every single flooding or issue that has ever transpired with underwater camera systems is it usually boils down to operator error. And so I would encourage anybody to get into it with whatever means that they would want to.
I think if I can jump in there too, you also need to decide where you think you might be going with your underwater photography journey. I absolutely agree. Getting a DSLR or mirrorless first, out of the gates is quite risky, especially if you're not sure you're going to do it. But there's two really good camera options on the market, three actually, and the one is the TG, and the other is the Canon G7X Mark III, and then you've got your Sony RX100, the different models there. And, the TG is great for jumping in the water and taking photos, but if you think you're going to be advancing in your underwater photography journey, I'd highly recommend people to get a compact, the Canon or the Sony. The reason for that is you can use manual settings on the Canon and the Sony, whereas with the TG it's quite difficult because you have to set it in a certain way to prevent motion blur and to get the right shutter speed. So TG is great if you just want to jump in the water, but if you think you might be wanting to learn more about underwater photography and using the manual settings, you can by all means start out with your Canon and your Sony in AV mode or program mode, but then you can at least grow with those cameras. So, it's always good to kind of think a bit ahead of where you want to go so that you don't have to keep replacing your cameras as you progress, because the compacts that I mentioned are really helpful and really useful to learn underwater photography with.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I was just going to say on what everyone is saying, one of the things that I remember learning that really stuck with me was that, I had bought a Canon 5D Mark IV, a full DSLR, and I remember reading that, someone said, it'll be just as good as your camera unless you learn how to use it, or as good as your phone, right? And so I always think about that, and it made me really start researching light and really, learning shutter speed and trying to learn all the controls, because it really is no matter what, if you have a nice camera, you're not going to be a good photographer, right? It's the person behind the camera, not how nice the camera is. And so I do meet a lot of divers that are like, oh, I want to be an underwater photographer, so I'm just going to buy the most expensive camera on the market and then I'm going to be it. It's no, definitely not. And so I always, thought about that and really pushed myself to be okay, today I'm focusing on shutter speed and that's it. Really breaking down each of the controls. And taking classes, I think, is super helpful. Annie teaches one here in Washington, but, there's tons of YouTube videos. And so just learning as much as you can above water, I think, is huge, and then getting in the water as much as you can. We have a local beach near us that there's not much there. It's just eelgrass and a couple of things, but we would go all the time because I was just practicing. And so that's what I always, try to tell people as well is, you just got to practice above water and below water.
There's that saying, you really must have a good camera because your photos are so great. And I've seen people, they've got the most expensive camera, but they don't know how to use it. If you don't know how to use it, you might as well not have it. So I think it's really important that for people to learn their cameras and know how to use it, because I find so many people, they're not happy with the pictures that they're taking because they don't know how to use the camera, and they think it's the camera, so they might go and buy a more expensive camera thinking that their photos are going to be better. But, it really all boils down to going out there, practicing, doing courses, knowing how to use your ISO, your shutter speed, your aperture. And once you understand how those all work together under the water, your photos really start improving.
So I agree with everybody and what we're all saying here. I think that many of us do. I think I'd like to add in another element of what is important when you're choosing a camera system, and it's also what kind of lights are you going to choose to go along with it. So traditionally, strobes, which give you a very fast burst of light, when somebody thinks of photography, they might think of strobes. A GoPro operates really well without any light, as do some of the smaller cameras for the mobile case. What I've done is for entry level photographers who are wanting to learn, and as Hannah mentioned, I teach here locally, and Kate, we're also cold water, so I dive in a dry suit year round. I also am lucky enough, I've lived in Indonesia and Australia and New Zealand and a lot of other warmer water. But here I have found that for somebody starting, it's very easy to start with constant light, which is video lights that you use to take photographs with. And there's pros and cons to every system, but when you can immediately get a result with one video light in macro mode on a camera, and somebody walks out of the water with something that's decent as their first shots with a camera system, which would be the TG6 or 7 now that Olympus has out, it's really rewarding. And so I think that we should talk a little bit about lights as well in relation to photography.
Yeah, absolutely. Light is everything underwater. And, where we dive, it's quite dark. So we do need to add artificial light, whether it's video lights or strobes. And, for somebody who's just starting out, they might not want to invest in a huge strobe, but in a strobe, which can be extremely expensive. So I agree. We start off a lot of people with their TGs and their video lights. And, that's one way of getting in the water, letting the bug bite, and learning how light works underwater and how it can affect your images. So I completely agree. Lighting is very important, whether it's a video light or a strobe. I think strobes do make underwater photography more easy because they freeze motion. So they're a little bit less forgiving than video lights, which, if you don't have the right amount of light, especially with your TG, your shutter speed can revert to being quite slow. So if you can afford a strobe, get one, but by all means start out otherwise with a nice strong video light, which will give your TG enough light to push up the shutter speed. It's quite a difficult camera to use if you don't have artificial light and if you're not diving in a nice bright area.
It's also kind of nice to have those continuous lights as a bonus of a dive light. And then you'll always have one of those on there, even if you move to strobes. Like still use strobes and video lights on my system, and use my video lights to look for things as well as shoot video. It's one of those things that you will never put away. You'll still keep using. So it's a great first investment.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, also your camera needs to see contrast to be able to focus quickly. So those video lights, or what we use focus lights as well, they help your camera see contrast and helps your camera focus so much more quickly, especially if you're diving in deeper areas where there's not so much light. So yeah, they're always useful, and you can show your buddy something. The lights light up better on the reef with the video light or a focus light, and the colors are just so much more bright. And it's easier to find things and show people things if you have one of those with you. So definitely a great investment to get when you're starting out in underwater photography.
A lot of times too, people have a light source that they've used always. So I'm a big fan of light and motion lights. And if I have full disclosure, I am an ambassador for light and motion. But with the light and motion lights, I was an early adopter, and I've used them from their inception. And when I had my first underwater video system, they came out with a lighting system that was really revolutionary. One of the things that people need to watch out for when choosing constant light is a spot versus a flood. And so a lot of times when I am talking to divers when they're first starting out with open water or their advanced class and they're choosing their first light, I'm guiding them to the thought that they're eventually going to get into underwater photo or video. And so I always recommend to get a light that does a spot and a flood for photography or video, knowing that constant lighting is so important. And then a lot of times on a system, I'll start somebody with one light for a macro that they put it right on top of their camera. And then they could have their handheld light that has become so popular on their wrist, and they could use it as creative lighting with their hand. And so there's a way that when you're investing in your equipment, if you're thinking about some of your different interests that you're going to do, that you could start building them into your continuing education and what you think you're going to be doing in the future.
I absolutely agree with you. That's absolutely fantastic advice.
I'll back up the light and motion lights. I love them. They're lightweight. They pack a punch with their light, and they do the spot and flood. I love them.
Yeah.
Is there charging good? That's the thing that drives me crazy about my lights, is they only last, in the cold water, they only last about 45 minutes.
I personally always went with the lumens that were higher than I needed, so I could use the lower settings so they would last longer, and then I could pump it up higher if I needed it, but then I was guaranteed to probably get a good 2 dives out of it.
Yeah, Jami, I agree with that. I think that everybody thinks that when you have these higher lumen lights that you need to burn it on the highest power setting. When I'm encouraging people to start with digital photography, the sensors are so sensitive to light that I'm encouraging people to start on a low power light. I think in the larger camera systems, I shoot with in my arsenal, I have TG6s, I have GoPros. I always buy the highest level GoPro whenever it comes out. Sometimes I'll skip a year, but there's really a big difference between a GoPro 4 and a GoPro 12. And people I always laugh, this happens all the time. I was just in Malpelo for a month, which is a small island off the coast of Colombia. And people pay $6,000, or you'll go to Galapagos and people have just invested $12,000 in a trip and they have a GoPro 3 or 4. And a GoPro usually comes out every September. It's like clockwork. Why not invest in the latest GoPro if you're going to go on a trip that is like a life-changing event? So with the lumens, you might not even need a light with something like a GoPro. When you get into a higher end system, the sensors read differently, and so you need the higher power light in order for the light to work, especially in darker water, deeper water, temperate water, just because the consistency of what's going on with the light in the different color temperatures of the water, if you would. I'm trying to be eloquent in how I say this. In the Pacific Northwest, Kate, I don't know if it's the same as South Africa, but Hannah and I live, and there could be a really dark algae bloom. We're known as the Emerald Sea because our water is so green, because of all of the life that's in it. So we just need brighter lumens when you go into a different type of camera system than an entry level, or when you want to start being creative with your light.
Yeah, I can completely agree with you. Yeah, we do sometimes get green water. We also get blue water, but we get the algae bloom, and then we sometimes have red tide, which means that normally there's sort of like a thermocline at about 5 meters, and below that it's nice and clear, but it does block out some of the light. So when it's light and bright, you can use a GoPro without any lights and without any filters. But the minute it starts getting a little bit darker, you do need to add lights. There are some really excellent filters for your GoPros. I'm not an ambassador or anything for them, but the backscatter flip adapters are absolutely amazing for GoPros. They've got magenta ones and red ones. And I found them so useful when we go diving to just add the red back and the blues back. It's just incredible, the colors that they bring back. But yeah, otherwise, deeper we go, the darker it is when we've got that red tide. Definitely need big video lights and better lighting so that we can firstly see where we are, see things on the reef, and be able to light up what we're seeing.
So to bring it back a little bit, when you're trying to find what you might be interested in, there's the small stuff, the big stuff, maybe shipwrecks, maybe the wide shots. How did you find what you were interested in? Was it just going out there and like, oh, okay, let me shoot this for a little bit? And is there different settings? I mean, obviously I know with macro as opposed to a wide shot, there's going to be a macro lens compared to a wide angle lens. Or was it just kind of you were just going with what was in your area? So I guess just kind of what what is your focus of interest and how did you find that?
I'll start. In San Diego, we have a pretty well-known shore dive at La Jolla Shores, and it's just 90% of the time macro. It's also one of the easiest places to get out and go diving all the time. We do dawn dives there before work, and so you just kind of migrate towards the macro side of things because that's what we have access to. However, you give me kelp any day of the week, and I will have my wide angle on. So if I can get out on the boats or out to Catalina or the Channel Islands, I am wide angle all the time and playing with close focus wide angle. So it does kind of depend on, what you're doing. I love both. I can't tell you which one I love more. It just wherever I am, I kind of gauge on what I'm doing. If I'm doing local, it's probably going to be macro. If I'm out at the islands, it's definitely wide. I don't care if it's 10 feet of viz. I'll make it work. I want to see that kelp.
I think it has to do with what is easiest. And so, Nick, if we're talking to our audience and they're beginners and they're wanting to get into it, I'd say macro is way easier than wide angle. And so for success, I always start a student with macro or somebody who has an idea that they might want to get started if they're going to shoot with a camera, and like leaving the GoPro out, because the GoPro, if you're going to shoot macro, you would need to get from Backscatter or one of the other companies a macro port for your GoPro, which they sell. And so leaving the GoPro out of this conversation and just talking more about photo or video, photography, I would say starting with macro is way easier than starting with wide angle. When you switch to wide angle, I always tell people to ease into the wide angle because macro gives us such a sense of confidence. When you're choosing your subject, I'm just going to add this in there. I'm amazed at how many people they say they want to get into photography, but then they don't know what's under there. And so they don't know. So my idea is, and this goes back to maybe how I learned, back when camera systems cost the price of a small car, everybody could not be a photographer. And so we often had to dive for years before we were able to pick up a camera system. I really think having really great dive skills and from the very beginning carrying a light source with you, that you're investigating what is literally living under the water, will really help you. And then pulling out dive books or going online and looking up what you are seeing helps you become a photographer and know what you like to see. So I know that Hannah started I Love Nudies, and people love nudies all over the world. We have incredible nudies right here in our underwater backyard. With kids and teens in our community, I built a website for our underwater backyard called edmondsunderwaterpark.com. And the reason why I did it is because I'm amazed at how many people do not go underwater in our backyard, and they have no idea what is living underneath the surface of the sea right here. And so our small town is about 100,000 people, and the majority of them are non-divers, and they don't have a clue as they look out. And so that's why I'm such a big advocate of get cameras in your hand, learn how to shoot good so we don't share crappy photos and videos, and get other people to fall in love with what we love. And I think it's about what is your passion, and then take photos of that and then share those with other people.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think especially when you're first becoming a diver, it's kind of overwhelming because you feel like everyone is an underwater photographer, right? And so you're like,
they are.
Yeah. And you're like, how could I ever compete with these people? And you're like, oh man, like why would I even get into it? It's kind of overwhelming. And then once you start getting more into it, and so you start appreciating everyone that's doing it, and you slowly start noticing everyone's styles, and that you can be someone different. You can have a different approach than other people, and I think that's huge. And especially when you're talking to non-divers, they're like, "Oh, you're an underwater photographer? Like that's amazing. That's incredible." We're sometimes being so wrapped up in the scuba world, we forget that it's very rare or it's very unusual because you just are always inundated with, amazing photos that people take. And so that's one of the things that I think, especially when you're first learning and you might not be as good as you want to be. And so it can be very disheartening. And so I'm always just telling people, just keep going, just like, no matter what, you will be different. You can come out different than what other people are shooting. And, you might go to the same dive site and find 10 things that I didn't find. And it's going to be really cool, and so it's more of a collaborative photography than straight competitive, which I think is really cool compared to like, other types of photography where people get really competitive against each other because they're seeing the same things and they're experiencing a lot of the same things, where underwater we are all very different. And so I think that's what makes underwater photography really cool, and also just try to encourage people to keep going and don't get, sometimes I tell people, even though my whole I Love Nudies thing is on Instagram, and I'm like, if you're in a slump and you just feel like you're not, producing as well as you want, or you're disappointed in your photography, I'm like, just delete Instagram for a while and just go dive and take photos. Like, don't worry about what other people are doing. Don't see other people's photos. Just focus on yourself and enjoying the sport and enjoying your photos. And then when you come back, they're going to be great, And so it's kind of a balance of looking at what other people are doing and then self-reflection as well. That kind of was a tangent that went off, but I definitely found my love for nudies very early, and so I always knew that I wanted to get into macro photography because I just loved the little slugs so much, and wanted to show people how beautiful they were. But I also am a huge wide angle fan, especially in the Pacific Northwest, because it's hard. And so when I do see a good wide angle photo, it's like I'm drawn to it because I know what went behind it and the skills that it took to get it. One of my other favorite things to do is take photos of divers. My husband is my number one subject because I always, especially for our family and friends that aren't divers, it gives perspective of, instead of just seeing, a sea slug, they're like, what am I looking at? Where if I can show like my husband looking at the sea, then they have a better, they can comprehend what's going on underwater more. And so I'm a huge fan of those as well.
Yeah, Hannah, people need to see people if they're non-divers. Like, people who are scuba divers, we can like look at underwater photographs without people, but people who are non-divers that do not understand this other world that we go into, they really do need to see people. So putting people in our shots are important.
Yeah, especially
if not for us, then for
and it's like
our friends.
Yeah, because my whole thing also, as I think all of us, is trying to get people in the water. And so I want to portray the sense of adventure and, exploration that's behind it. And so instead of just showing them a photo, I'm like showing the divers exploring the area. And so that is always huge. But it is tough. I've actually bounced between macro and wide angle as I've been doing this, and I think that's also super fun. You don't have to pick one and then stick with it. I had the whole DSLR system and was super happy with it, absolutely loved it, flooded it, and then got pregnant. And so now I have a TG6, so I've gone backwards because I wanted more simple, I can't go diving all the time now that I'm a new mom, so I wanted a smaller, simpler system, and I'm super happy with it right now. I do know I'm going to eventually go back, but I'm happy with what I have right now. And so I think it also, what you're shooting just depends on where you are in life.
I was saying, I love the whole just encouraging people to take photos for themselves and not get caught up in the hype of competing with other people. And I've said that a bajillion times to people as well. So it's like, I don't really care what other people want to categorize my photos as. Let's talk about what happened. Let's talk about the amazing experience of, I just saw 8 octopuses rolling around together, and this may not be the best shot, but that was so cool to see. And to encourage people to want to see that, I think, is huge.
Jami, where did you see 8 octopus rolling together? Like, where? Because like, I want to see the proof. I don't care what the shot looks like. Where did you see 8 octopus rolling together?
In La Jolla and the shores.
Really?
Yes, it was like fallish is kind of like the octopus mating season.
Yep.
And we always joke about it. We call it octoporn. And a lot of people miss it. because they don't realize that octopus blend in so well. But if you know that it's at the season and you kind of look around and there's certain areas of the canyon, you start noticing eyeballs and there's multiple eyeballs around. And if you just sit and wait, all of a sudden you see like long tentacles come out and then they're all starting to like attack each other because they're not monogamous at all. And
No, cephalopods
I'll
are
send
my
you a video
favorite.
later.
I want to see it because cephalopods are my favorite. I have GPOs up here, but I lived down in Southern California for many years, and so the Channel Islands are part of my stomping ground. But I've never been diving in La Jolla, so I'd love to come diving with you. But
Let me know.
yeah, I have this sequence of GPOs. Actually, they were guarding a female's eggs, but there were 3 males that we saw like every time we went and dove a dive site called Flagpole here. And these 2 GPOs went after each other, and talking to one of my friends who's a scientist, they think it was just males fighting one another. And I am also a huge fan of octos, and understanding that like the difference between photos and videos is when you take a photo, you're capturing a moment in time. And when you're capturing video, you want to get behavior. And so I'm a behaviorist. I'm an underwater voyeurist. I love octos mating, fighting. I love fish porn. The more, the merrier. I love spawning aggregations and hunts. But for those kinds of scenes, that's when you want to shoot video. There's really
You're so my people.
Yeah.
I had somebody ask me, why do you post so much of animals doing it? I'm like, because it's hilarious.
You know, it's a fish's life. What do? They eat, they try not to get eaten, they mate, and they die. Like, that's like it. That's their life. And so we're capturing about 25% of the activity of their lives. So fish porn, that's where it's at.
So I do have another question to steer it in a different direction, but I do the topic is pretty hilarious. So some people you'll hear sometimes if your diving buddy is a photographer, you're pretty much diving solo. So what do you do to kind of combat that? And then also, is that true? Because I know photographers can get really focused on what they're doing, and then, or is that like, I don't want to say a myth, but like, is that something that you deal with? Or are you just going out with other photographers and, you know, seeing what like, so like everyone's kind of off on their own? Because does the question make sense?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's very difficult if you're a photographer and your buddy isn't a photographer. And I'm lucky because my husband and my buddy is a photographer. And if I'm not diving with him, if he's instructing, then I will try to buddy up with another photographer. I think it's just better because it's you can share it more with another photographer. If you've got a buddy who's hanging around and swimming around and getting bored, it actually puts pressure on you as the photographer to hurry up. And then, you know, you kind of lose your concentration because you're so worried about the other person who's not a photographer, and because you want them to enjoy their dive too. But yeah, it's very difficult. I'm one of those photographers who probably take 4 or 5 photos and move on, just because that's the way I've learned to take photos. Because I was following my husband and his students, I basically had time to take a couple of pictures and follow them. Otherwise, I would lose them and get lost. So it is difficult. You know, if you haven't got a regular buddy if you haven't got a buddy who's a photographer, then it can be quite a hassle. I've seen husbands and wives getting quite irritated with each other when the one is taking pictures and the other isn't. It's nice if you're doing wide angle and your buddy will model for you. That's great. But, you know, if you're there trying to get 100 shots of a nudibranch and your buddy's getting bored, it's not the greatest, I must say.
She just described me and my husband.
Same.
Sorry.
No, it's totally a joke. He just gets so annoyed with me because I take so long. And so eventually gets to the point we dive with other couples and the girls seem to be the photographers and the guys just take off and we're like, bye.
Yeah, that's definitely the same with me and my husband. We joke that he's just my safety diver, right? He just like is following me around what I do. And so I usually prefer to dive with other photographers because of that. So when I'm with my husband, I'm definitely very conscious of that he's not a photographer. And so like Kate was saying, I will just not spend as much time on something, or I will even just leave my camera behind. And so I think being conscious of who you're with is important. And then I will go with divers and take my camera, and so it's kind of, I also think it depends on where you're diving. A lot of times if it's a new dive site that I've never been to, I'm just going to leave the camera and explore it and then come back with my camera. And that usually helps with the other divers because they have less of the, I need to see the new stuff, and they're more patient about being like, oh, where's Hannah? Just taking a picture of a nudie. But I think there is for sure, it's tough. Because you do find something that you want to take 100 photos of, but you have to be safe, so it's tough.
So, Nick, I think this is a really important question, and I think that there's a lot of different layers to it. If I am going out as a professional for a shoot, a lot of times I'll have a safety diver, and their job is to keep me safe, and they have to follow me. So then I get to make the decisions on everything. If I'm teaching photography, somebody's new, they're a newer diver, or they're an advanced diver and they have lots of dives, but they want to get into photography, the number one thing I'm teaching that diver is to be a good buddy with your camera. A lot of times people don't get that from the very beginning, and then they're very selfish, or they're going, I worked at many resorts around the world, and somebody shows up and they're like, well, I've got my camera, I've paid for my trip, and I'm just gonna do whatever I want, and I'm not gonna respect the rules. And that kind of diver is just not what needs to be in the water with a camera, unless you are bringing somebody who's going to be your safety diver. And so I think that it's really important that we have to understand when you're starting out, when you're shooting with a camera, you use your air differently, you forget about your computer, you really have to think basic scuba 101, even though you've got your camera, and you should be diving with somebody who understands that so you don't get yourself in trouble, because you really lose yourself behind your lens when you're not trained. And so thank you for asking that question and wondering, what our opinions are on that. And I'd say there's many different levels to it when we're diving with different kinds of buddies, and then with our camera. And anybody who's going to dive alone with their camera, they should be a self-reliant diver, and they should be carrying a sling tank, a spare mask, and doing everything that's right for our sport, because when everything goes right and we follow all the rules, diving is safe. But something can happen. A current could come up. There's a lot of things that can happen. And so you always want to think safety first, camera second.
Also, to tag on to that, I'm very lucky that I have like a pretty regular group of divers that I go with, where we have a very same skill level, air consumption. We have an understanding. We talk about our dive plan ahead of time, directions that we're going in, what we're looking to shoot. And then while we will not be like shoulder to shoulder underwater, like we always make sure we can see a light. So everyone's within a distance of each other. In addition, though, I did do the self-reliant class, not to purposefully go diving all the time, but like if I am in a situation that I was on a liveaboard and paired up with someone I didn't know, I want to be able to know that I can take care of myself. And I think that was just a really great class just to have under your belt for a skill level. But as like everyone's been saying, as photographers, you do get caught up behind the lens. And if something happens, it's really great to have that skill set behind you to make you a stronger diver, stronger photographer, and know that you're safe.
And when you go in with a group of people that you're talking about camaraderie and this sort of thing, and like Jami, what you just said about, hey, having an idea before you get in the water of what you want to shoot, because then your friends could tell you, Annie, there it is, or Jami, this is what you want to see, and we can share with one another. Like if I dove with Hannah, I would definitely show her unique nudies. I wouldn't show her every nudie I found, but if I found something very unique, like a whole bunch of Malibu nudibranchs feeding and mating in the eelgrass at Edmonds, I'd be like, Hannah, get there now, right? Like, so it's really nice to have that camaraderie when you're trying to capture images underwater too.
Hannah really likes lingpods too.
Yes, I do.
I just wanted to say I have to completely agree with that. Sometimes there are some people who you will dive with and they won't even show you what they've seen because they're so competitive that they don't want to share it with you. And that's not the kind of dive buddy I ever want to be. And that's not the kind of dive buddy I ever want to dive with, because underwater photography and scuba diving is such a thing that we all need to share, and we all love it. So we need to share it with each other and put aside that competition, because I actually went on a trip now to Romblon, and one of the guys on the trip said to me, but what if we see the same thing? Then our photos are going to be the same. But we all see things differently. So your photos are never going to be the same as anyone else's. And I think, we need to remember that. We've all got our own styles. We all see things differently, and we all photograph things differently. So it's just so important to go diving and enjoy it and share the love of it and the love of underwater photography with other people too. And I think that's what it's all about.
Awesome. No, that's great advice. So one last question, because we only allotted an hour, and I feel like this is a conversation that we could go on for hours with. And I feel like I'm getting better than this. I feel like that people that started on film or will even revert back to film are a lot better than this. But when I first started, I was just shoot and try to filter through it later. But I kind of threw out the question in the email up there, 5 shots or 500. So are you going out there and setting a limit? Like I'm only taking 10 shots, so they have to be magnificent shots, or are you just kind of trigger happy? And obviously I feel like when I speak to more experienced photographers, it's the fewer shots and then just trying to make those shots work.
I think it kind of depends on what you're shooting. I love the idea of less is more. And I think I've slowly over the years kind of moved towards trying to do less and like work on composition and look at my settings and try to make it better. But then this weekend I was also diving with like 100 baby sea lion pups, and it's just, you're trigger happy at that point because there's everywhere all at once. So chewing on you, biting on you, it's like, what do I do? It's just on me. I'm just gonna hit, because I can't even see my screen right now because it's deciding to like lie on it. So but I think as a new person, it's good to utilize the fact that you have the ability to take 5,000 photos so that you can look at them and be like, what do I not like about them and how can I make it better? And with all this stuff that we have in this day and age, you can see how settings work together and be like, okay, well, maybe I'll try this differently another time. And I always tell people too, like, if you're struggling with your settings, find something that's stationary underwater and sit there and go through all the shutter speeds and then go back and go through all the f-stops so you can understand how those correlate together. And just do it over and over and over, exact same setup, and that will help you understand.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and that's definitely how I started, was seeing the settings since they're so different underwater. And so I was definitely trigger happy in the beginning, but I have definitely moved towards less is more, mostly just because of my time. Like, I don't have time to go through 500 photos after a dive anymore. I used to be able to sit through and be like, oh, this one is slightly better than the other one. But now I'm like, I just can't. I don't have 2 hours after a dive to be able to do that. And so I'm definitely 5 shots is more. I do have a film camera, which I love, and I love because of that, because it makes you think that way and be like, this is the shot that I envisioned before I even got in the water. This is what I'm going to plan for. But yeah, I think it just depends.
One of the things I do is I let another photographer go first, and I let them, take their pictures and get their angles and everything. And whilst they're doing that, I look at the subject, I decide which angle I'm going to go in at. I set up my settings so that when it's my turn, I can go in and I can take the photos. Because as Hannah said, we've only got so much time to go through all our photos, and definitely less is more. So if you can think beforehand how you're going to take the picture and then go in and take those shots, not only are you thinking more about the photo that you're going to take and, your settings that you're going to be using, but you're also not hogging that subject for the next person coming along. Because sometimes, there's a few of us diving together and there's only a few subjects in a certain space. So everyone wants to take a photo of something, especially if it's a unique nudie brank or something like that. You really have to get in there, take your pictures, and leave again so that the other people can take photos too, because it's really not fair if you're taking 500 photos of something and there are still other people waiting to take their turn. So I think it's also a matter of thinking beforehand and also being more caring towards other photographers as well.
I love that. That's an excellent point.
I would agree with everybody, and not to just be in agreement with what we're saying. I think it really depends on who you are underwater as well. I think that when you first start with a camera, the majority of people are like not taking enough photos of the subject they're taking pictures of. So for a beginner, I would say have an idea that for every subject that you come across, you're going to take 3 to 5 photos of that subject to make sure you have one in focus, right? Like, so, and that you've composed it the way you want. So for me, I'm like Jami, but if I have a situation with 100 sea lions or manta rays or sharks or anything that is like amazing, I have enough experience underwater to know, don't worry about taking 500 shots, right? Swimming with humpback whales, I love it. I get to be a little bit more choosy after doing it for so many years about what I want to see. So I feel like with experience, as you gain experience, you know when you have these golden nugget moments that is worthy of 300 to 500 shots, right? Like that, and we've all been there on a situation that we have that. And so that's a loaded question for us, I think, Nick. I think one thing to remember is when you're starting, people who are shooting photo, and I like calling it imaging because almost every camera does both photo and video, that if you're shooting photography, it is a little bit of a quicker capture than when somebody is shooting video and they're behaviorists and they're needing the peak of the action to be captured. And that's, I think, an even harder person to dive with is somebody who's trying to capture behavior, and that those kinds of pairings are even more important than photography. And so one thing that I'd like to just add in there is if I'm running a trip, I am taking into consideration who is the photographer and who is the video people, and I'm trying to put them together on different boats. If I am going on a trip and somebody else is leading, I am asking them, hey, could you consider the people that are doing video different than the people doing photography? And I think that's an important discernment for any kind of dive operator to make, but also for people who are divers to understand that video is just a different beast than photography.
Awesome. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful and insightful, and I really hope that we could get this group together again and maybe do a part 2, because I feel like we could just go on. I still have so many questions because it's something that I've been inching towards, is getting my camera underwater, but it just hasn't happened yet. And the more underwater photographers I speak to, I'm like, man, I got to pull the trigger and buy a housing and just get this thing underwater.
Nick, as you're telling us appreciations, I just want to give one shout out, because in our industry, it has been a very male-dominated industry since my inception into the program. And I really honor that we have Jami, Kate, and Hannah and myself on this call, and that we are 4 powerful women who know what they're doing and are celebrated for that, because I think that the woman's voice is missing from image creation on a grand scale, even though there's a lot of underwater photographers out there that are women and that are starting out. And I just really would like to call attention to the fact that women supporting women in the sport of diving is a very important part. And so if anybody's listening, I'm sure I speak for Hannah, Kate, and Jami, that email us, send us a message on our Instagram or on our YouTube channels or whatever social media is right for you. We want to bring and encourage and inspire you to share your voice and to share what you see underwater with an audience, because there's people in this world that will only listen to your voice. And so whether it's your inspiration, being inspired by Hannah, Kate, Jami, myself, or Nick, we want to inspire you. I think I speak for all of us. We want to inspire others into action with their cameras and their voices for our underwater world.
Absolutely. Well said. Couldn't have said it better. Thanks.
Thanks, Annie.
That was amazing. No, that really was. And and this has been an amazing group. So yeah, I really, really appreciate everybody coming on here, and I hope that we could definitely do this again, because this has been absolutely wonderful. So thank you very, very much for everybody coming on tonight, this morning. I think it's morning mostly for everybody. Early morning for me, early morning.
It's 8 p.m. here.
Thank you for having us. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. It's been amazing. And it's just so refreshing to speak to other women underwater photographers and just chat, because that's something that, as Annie said, it's something that's really missing. And I miss it down here on the southernmost tip of Africa. I don't have this connection with people down here, and it's just been fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick, and it's been lovely having Hannah and Jami and Annie here too. And thank you so much for the opportunity, and it would be amazing if we could do it again. It really would. There's so much more to chat about.
Off-gassing, a scuba podcast.